Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for a webinar hosted by Vault Product Manager Andy Minoski. Today, we will be discussing how to prepare for GDPR compliance with HashiCorp Vault. I'd like to introduce you to Andy. He's on the screen. Andy will talk you through key articles of GDPR and how Vault features correlate, then go into a Mount Filters demo. Andy will then answer any questions from all of you. I also want to note that this webinar is recorded and the recording will be made available after post-processing, usually within a day or two. I'll email it out to all of you. With that, let's go ahead and get started. Take it away, Andy.
Thanks so much, Amanda. Hello, everyone. Nice to meet you. My name is Andy Minoski. I'm the product manager here at HashiCorp for Vault. And let's go talk a little bit about GDPR. So as Amanda said, the agenda for today is that we're going to go talk a little bit really quickly about Vault, just to make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of terminology, sort of what is kind of the broad vision of Vault and how we think about it here at HashiCorp. And then we're going to dive deep into GDPR, specifically sort of the data security provisions, aka what is GDPR being prescriptive about, and sort of how you should lay out your governance and regulatory compliance within your organization, as well as some of the other kind of broader mandates. And then penalties and enforcement. How is GDPR enforced? What are some of the penalties associated with non-compliance with GDPR, et cetera? From there, we'll kind of switch gears and go talk a little bit more about how GDPR applies to Vault. So we're going to specifically talk about three areas. First, unified identity and policies. Second, control groups, and then finally, mountain filters. And with mountain filters, we're actually going to show a demo about how one can centrally manage a global Vault infrastructure while at the same time complying with data sovereignty regulations like GDPR and other kinds of what we call extraterritorial compliance regulations like the GDPR. So first, really quickly about Vault, why we created it and sort of where we see it fitting into the market. There's an overall shift that we see here at HashiCorp that not just Vault, but all the products, Terraform, Nomad, Consul, et cetera, focus on trying to provide solutions for. And that's like that transition is the shift from static to dynamic infrastructure. So we're moving from a world where we have one single monolithic server or a set of monolithic servers to a world where compute, storage, networking, et cetera, all of these sorts of compute primitives spanned across a large distributed infrastructure. And it's an infrastructure that doesn't necessarily sit on-prem. It sits in a combination of in the cloud, and public clouds, and private clouds. It's an infrastructure that sits in multiple types of computing infrastructures. So it's not simply just a VM or a physical server. It is containers. It is increasingly serverless infrastructures. And it's an infrastructure that spans across a wide variety of what we would traditionally consider to be walled gardens, so different types of operating systems, different types of platforms, different types of applications. In this world, being able to secure, protect, and run your applications and your infrastructure for those applications is a critical need. And this is where Vault fits into sort of trying to provide solutions around security, just as Terraform provides solutions around provisioning, just as Packer provides solutions around building, et cetera. So, specifically speaking about Vault, Vault exists in a world where you have your secrets infrastructure spanning across this diversity of different types of compute, this diversity of different types of application workload, this diversity of different types of walled gardens and platforms. So across different public clouds, across your own private cloud, across your own infrastructure, et cetera. The focus is how do I centralize management for secrets and then ultimately orchestrate security workflows across this very diverse world. And specifically to that point, when we look at how security was laid out for most of the last 15 to 20 years, the focus has really been about perimeter-based security. And in a world where you have a very diverse compute infrastructure and a very diverse infrastructure around the disposition of where your resources are in terms of identity, where your resources are in terms of the applications that are running, where your resources are in terms of sorts of what is the end goal of using that sensitive information, it gets really hard to define the perimeter. I mean, even beyond the fact that we live in a world with very, very advanced adversaries where we need to sort of accept that the curtain wall of the castle is effectively been breached frequently, it's really hard to define where the castle starts and ends if I'm spanning my infrastructure across multiple public clouds and my own private cloud and my own data center. So this is really a world that we've really focused on building Vault towards. How do I extend that security across this very diverse infrastructure? And how do I do it in a way that allows me to still centralize management of identity, secrets, and then ultimately the workflows associated with those secrets? So this is really the goal of Vault. It's three things: to provide a single source of secrets for all humans and machines, to scale to meet the security needs of your large organizations, and ultimately to allow for the complete secret lifecycle management of, again, your centralized infrastructure across this extremely diverse infrastructure of compute resources, security infrastructure, identity, etc. We really boil this down into three use cases with Vault, and we'll, whether you're seeing this on this webinar, whether you'll see us talking about it in blogs or at shows, the focus is really on three things. First, secrets management. How do I ultimately manage sensitive information, store that, and protect that in a way that allows me to operate at a very, very large scale? Now, this is something that is both for Vault Enterprise as well as for Vault Open Source. How do I be able to scale with a very large and increasingly spreading set of sensitive information in a way that doesn't break sort of my existing workflow? And we're going to talk about this a little bit more when we talk about mount filters, but in the context of GDPR, this is really important because most of the users that we see with Vault, as well as the users that are using Vault Enterprise, they live in a world where secrets are spread in a global manner. And this is actually something that's really critical if you are especially using the public cloud, because you don't necessarily know where your data is moving or sitting at any given time physically. So GDPR requires you to be sensitive and kind of make a best effort in terms of protecting the data sovereignty of your sensitive information. That's something that's very critical and part of secrets management. Encryption as a service. The net of this is, how do I make cryptography easier? When we talk to a lot of users of Vault that have really deep technical backgrounds and understand cryptography because they've gone to graduate school and have advanced degrees in mathematics, et cetera. But in the real world, they are a minority. The focus is on how I make the power of cryptography much easier to use and much easier to wield in terms of protecting my information. Then finally, privileged access management. The net of this is that identity sits everywhere. You have multiple different types of identity. Most users of Vault, especially at scale, have different ways of authenticating and proving who a certain person is. So privileged access management here is about, given these various different types of diverse identity infrastructures, and then ultimately a very diverse set of compute infrastructures, how do I broker access to all those without having to set up a lot of different custom workflows or threads to connect between them? This is important from a security perspective, not just from a ease of use and usability perspective as well, because with PAM, as with anything in security, complexity breeds problems. And in the real world, we don't really steal secrets by being Alan Turing and crypto-analytically attacking encryption. What we do is we exploit side channel attacks to be able to break in, kind of work around the encryption. So PAM is really critical, as well as all of the other use cases with Vault, but specifically with PAM, with being able to simplify the orchestration of identity and movement across different multiple clouds. And that simplification ultimately leads to better security. So let's switch gears and talk about GDPR, aka why we're all here. So GDPR stands for the General Data Protection Regulation. It's a framework that defines the protection of data from a security perspective, from a privacy perspective, for EU residents, nominally citizens, but there's a little bit of complexity there. There isn't actually, we'll talk about that a little bit deeper in this presentation, but there isn't a lot of prescription about what an agent is within GDPR, but it's generally assumed to be a citizen and their data. It was drafted into law in 2016, and it goes into effect very soon, so May 25th, 2018. When it goes into effect, all of these security controls and government regulatory compliance controls associated with protecting against GDPR need to be in place. And finally, this is perhaps one of the most interesting requirements of GDPR. It's extraterritorial. So what extraterritorial means is that when you are managing data that is governed by the GDPR, it doesn't require you to be in the EU. If you are, for example, a US entity who has EU citizen data that is covered under the GDPR, you are responsible for complying with GDPR, even though you may not be an EU organization. And if you are found in non-compliance, the penalties will apply to you regardless. Now, as we talk through GDPR and some of the articles associated with GDPR, I want to emphasize that this is not an exhaustive review of the subject. There are going to be different sorts of perceptions of GDPR from an auditor's perspective, from a legal perspective in terms of sort of compliance and non-compliance. And this is really important when we talk about penalties, because there are actually two tiers for penalties associated with sort of how non-compliant you are and how much effort you've put in. So the net of this is that what we would hope to do is this presentation is kind of the training wheels version of how GDPR may apply to you, we highly encourage you to go speak to your own kind of corporate lawyer or other counsel, especially those that are focusing on EU law, to kind of get a better understanding of sort of the nuts and bolts of the details of GDPR. That's important because at the end of the day, the devil's really lie in the details for GDPR, as well as every other government regulatory compliance regulation. GDPR is very specific terminology associated with sort of who is who within the mandates within the GDPR. So let's go over a little bit about what those roles are. The first is a data subject. This is who the data is, basically the owner of the data that, as the manager of infrastructure that governs GDPR data, it's the person who's the EU citizen or the individual whose data is ultimately being managed, being processed. The data subject part here is a little bit tricky because, again, while it's generally assumed to be an EU citizen, GDPR actually is a little bit vague here in terms of who the data subject is supposed to be. So there are going to be perceptions of GDPR that say that the data subject can be, for example, anyone who's in the EU at the time. Again, US citizens, for example, who are within the EU, but because they're accessing and storing data on an EU server, they might become a data subject. There are going to be perceptions that strictly say that this is a sovereign issue of the European Union, and as such, the data subjects are going to be EU citizens. This again highlights why you need to talk to your auditors and you need to talk to your corporate counsel in terms of what we should be focusing on from the data subject perspective. Now, from the data subject whose data we're protecting, we move into the processor. Processor is the individual that's going to be processing that data, hence the name. But another way to think about it is sort of the person who owns the application that is using that data. So let's say that we're making a photo sharing app. And the data that's being shared with the photo sharing app with regards to the data subject is data that's governed under GDPR. It's personally identifiable data. It's sensitive information about their location, their address, etc. The processor would be the developers of the photo sharing app. The controller, on the other hand, would be the person who's managing the infrastructure that application sits on. So let's say that photo sharing app is run by company X. Well, the processor in this case is going to be company X's development team, but the controller is going to be whoever is the CIO / the IT organization of company X. The person whose data, who's ultimately managing where that data sits, how that data is protected, and then ultimately how do I comply with a lot of the major points of GDPR. Within the controller and sort of managing the infrastructure of all this is the DPA, or the data protection officer. This is the person who at the end of the day is ultimately responsible for compliance with GDPR. If something should go wrong, this is the person that ultimately has to manage the resolution around say a data breach, or say managing how one complies with the relevant authorities. And then the supervisory authorities are simply the authorities. This is the national regulatory body within every EU member state that's also responsible for enforcing compliance with GDPR. This varies depending upon which country that you're in. So the supervisory authority in France, for example, will not be the same for the supervisory authority within Germany. It's really important, again, that you focus on, when you're looking at where your GDPR data sits physically, to look at who are these supervisory authorities that might govern your access to that data. Because again, should you be in non-compliance with GDPR, they're going to play a major role in sort of levying fines, as well as determining which fine structure you fall into. There are a lot of articles for GDPR, but they really fall into kind of three areas. The first is the individual rights. So if I'm a data subject, what are the rights that I have to my data? This is where GDPR gets really interesting, because there are things like I have the right to delete my own data. I have the right to request access to it. The data subjects' individual rights here are really important because they imply requirements on the processors and especially the controllers in terms of providing access and the ability to comply with these rights. Basis for processing also a series of articles within GDPR that really focus on, does the processor have access to the data for a legitimate reason? And that's really important because GDPR really focuses on privacy. And so processors should in no way have access to data that they're not actively using. And as a consequence of that, this whole area is really about the processor requirements for GDPR. Governance, accountability, and security are kind of the rest of the GDPR, and ultimately the meat of the regulation. This is really focused on the obligations of the controller. So how is the data managed and stored? What are the kind of security provisions that I need to think about? And then finally, what do I do during a data breach, and how do I respond to it accordingly? So individual rights. There are a lot of different rights that you have as a data subject within GDPR. The main are the right to information and access. So I need to be able to, I have the right to basically know where my data is being used, and I have the right to consent to its accession and usage by a processor. Right to erasure. This is really important actually, because this is something that implies, I mean, all of these these individual rights imply requirements on the controller and the processor, but the right to erasure implies something that is that might be very difficult to implement, which is I have the right to demand that my data has been destroyed and then ultimately to receive notification, proper notification that has been destroyed. If the right to erasure is kind of like fibbed, so if there's smoke and mirrors around the data being destroyed, it is a very serious state of non-compliance within GDPR. So key to think about. Rights to object, rights to restrict process. So I have the right to basically say, hey, I've given you access to my data, but I need to be able to know what my data is being used for. And if I don't like how that data is being used, I have the right to restrict access to it, and then ultimately to restrict access to the controller as a whole. So not just simply the processor, but all the entities that are controlling that processor. I have the right to move that data around. I have the right to rectification is interesting. So if I see that data is inaccurate, I have the right to actually change that data that's being stored within the processor, or that's being used by the processor and stored within the controller. And then finally, the right to lodge a complaint. So I have the ability to petition a supervisory authority. That one is one of the only few individual rights that do not imply a feature or a requirement on either the processor or especially the controller. But what's unique about it is the fact that it will spark an investigation that will kind of go line by line through each one of the individual rights and scrutinize sort of how you are complying or not complying to it. And again, if you're found in non-compliance, the penalties are significant. The basis for processing. This is really going on the obligations of, well, both the processor controller, but especially the processor. So GDPR is really interesting. It sees the transmission of data to a processor, to an organization that's going to be using and storing that data, really as kind of a contract. So just like any other contract, there needs to be power of acceptance or consent. Has the user given you access to that data? Just like any other contract, there needs to be sort of the consent here is really important, because there are requirements around sort of making sure that you have properly given power of acceptance to that user. That's really critical. Also, necessity is a really key important area here. Is your interaction with this data necessary? Again, this is kind of subjective depending upon your auditor and sort of your interpretation of GDPR. But what's not subjective is that you make a best effort around determining necessity. If you do not, this kind of leads you towards the non-compliance area or the negligence area of the fine structure for GDPR if you're found in non-compliance, which can be very bad. And then finally, the obligations around processor and controller rights. So what are my contractual rights? Again, this is a contract. I am contracting my usage of a data subject's data subject to their usage of my application or the necessity around my using their data. What are the other kind of contractual obligations that I have supplemental to providing them their individual rights? And then finally, governance, accountability, and security, really the core of GDPR. So how this really comes down to how will GDPR data be stored, protected, and audited? How do I ensure that processors have least privilege access to GDPR data? This is kind of the opposite side of necessity. So yes, we assume that there is a necessary usage of this data for processors, but how do I make sure that only they're using the necessary data? This goes back to best effort again. Accountability, how do I make sure that everything's audited, that's tracked, that in the event that there's an investigation that needs to be launched as a consequence of a data breach, or someone has filed a petition with a supervisory authority, how do I make sure that the actions are auditable and the obligations are properly cited within the infrastructure that you're using? And then finally, security. How will GDPR data be protected? So what are the obligations for disclosure that exist during a data breach? What do I do when things go wrong? All of this is really critical to understand because the penalties for GDPR are very significant. There are two tiers of penalties for GDPR, non-negligence and negligence. Non-negligence is either the greater of 10 million euros or 2% of global annual revenue. And negligence, which is much more likely to be what you are struck with in the event of a non-compliance with GDPR is the greater of either 20 million euros or 4% of annual global revenue. You can start to understand why people are very concerned about GDPR when you look at these numbers, because if you are an organization like Microsoft, like Apple, like a large organization who has access to your basically European Union citizen data or data that is subject to the GDPR, being found in non-compliance of GDPR for any issue will result in potentially crippling fines. And this isn't something that is necessarily just for sort of like large Fortune 1000 companies. I think that the numbers there are much more staggering when you're talking about like every issue of non-compliance is several $billion potentially worth of fines. But even for smaller organizations, perhaps even more, especially for smaller organizations, a 4% global annual revenue penalty is significant and potentially crippling, depending upon the economics of your business. It's also critical to note here that this is for every time of non-compliance is found. So if you have multiple data breaches in a year, heaven forbid, this could result in a series of fines that would potentially cripple your business, as well as this is again an extraterritorial requirement. This is something that you're subject to regardless of whether you sit in the European Union or whether you sit in the United States, APAC, etc. So how these fines are determined, this is why it's so important to go talk to your auditors as well as your lawyers, because the negligence is determined by a vector of different factors that are in many ways very subjective. Most supervisory authorities rather will kind of move towards supporting a penalty structure associated with the negligence tier, just because if you are found in non-compliance with GDPR, usually there's a lack of bona fide security best effort. There may be other kinds of issues around how you try to comply with GDPR. Ultimately, it's up to the supervisory authority. And it's important to note that because the supervisory authority for the specific member country of the EU can also issue supplemental fines. So not only would you be subject to non-compliance with GDPR with the overall European Union, but you also may be subject to supplemental fines from Germany or France or Spain, etc. So let's switch gears and talk a little bit about how Vault can help you align your organization and your security infrastructure with GDPR. So the first is unified identity and policies. So the real value of unified identity within Vault is the ability to protect individual rights and enforce basis for processing. Really quickly on what unified identity is. So this is within Vault, there is an identity infrastructure that was released in Vault 0.8 across all versions of Vault that allows you to centralize sorts of the concepts of identity, regardless of whatever authentication method you're accessing Vault with. So if you're accessing Vault with an identity system that spans across, say, GCP within that spans across, say, so LDAP, Active Directory. The idea behind the unified identity is being able to span across all of them and then recognize sorts of commonalities. Alice, for example, may have a GitHub access token to auth into Vault with. She may have an AD credential. She may also have an MFA token. All of these kinds of different pieces of auth need to centralize to the same individual. And so that's the focus is on unified identity as being able to centralize on this concept of an entity that has multiple different types of methods for being able to kind of access themselves and then being able to group those entities to manage policies across all of them. So what this allows you to do is specifically within GDPR, there's an article 35, that focuses on really being able to, in the event of a data breach, track sort of the relevant organizations, individuals that were hit as part of this to track the taxonomy of the attack. This allows you to comply with that by allowing you to, with Vault's audit log, see specifically who are the individuals that had access to data, as well as to thread sorts of their pattern of access. And ultimately, if you're using a SIM solution like an ArcSight or an Alien Vault or a Splunk, to be able to track the actions associated with them and provide best effort around mitigating these kinds of attacks. Managing policy through unified identity really allows controllers to control processor access, and this is really important for complying with the articles around around necessity for data access, as well as complying for sorts of just in general restricting access to people that only need to use it. So this, again, we go back to talking about the opposite side of necessity for data access for processors, minimum minimum access as possible to ensure compliance with GDPR. And then finally, so dynamic secrets and tokens, when you tie these to unified identity, so basically when you tie sorts of how Vault recognizes different types of secret workflows or access to certain secrets to these identity pieces, you can really quickly and easily be able to approve or deny access to for the purposes of legitimate basis processing in a really simple way. Now, you can do this without unified identity policies. I think that being able to enforce RBAC is something that's pretty common across all secrets management suites, but being able to do so at scale in a simple way with maybe just one command or one call to the API is something that's very unique to Vault. And it's something that is really critical to understand because, again, in security, simplicity leads to better security. Complexity leads to problems. We don't want to raise issues around a side channel attack or not even accessing that data, something like a denial of service attack, by having to complicate sorts of RBAC. So it's really important to make RBAC as simple as possible, and that's why we design unified identity. Control groups are a Vault feature that is a Vault Enterprise feature, and the idea behind this is to provide dual controller authorization. So one of the things that goes into necessity and the governance and accountability requirements of GDPR is around providing a group of controllers whose role is to basically authorize access to processors when they're attempting to access data subjects as data. And to allow them to basically have another chain of custody in terms of authorizing when should a processor gain access to data subjects data. GDPR articles 26 through 28 really focus on this. And so you can implement controller provisions that directly map to the functionality within control groups. This is something that is we actually thought about when we were designing control groups within Vault Enterprise, was what are the GDPR regulations around how do I have multiple authorizers for access to a certain set of specific data. So in fact, even the name control groups, it was originally called something else during development, comes from the fact that we wanted to align it as close as possible with GDPR. So being able to have this group of individuals who authorize access to sensitive information to a separate secret path allows you to automate the necessity requirements as well as many of the governance and auditability requirements for GDPR, specifically Articles 26 through 28. And finally, mount filters. This is perhaps the most important part of GDPR, which is how to make sure that GDPR data doesn't go to a locality that it shouldn't be bound for. Specifically, Article 35 within the GDPR focuses on sort of data sovereignty, and the idea behind Article 35 is you cannot move GDPR data to a locale that does not have at least as good data protection requirements as the GDPR. One of those locales is the United States, for example. So being able to restrict the physical movement of data between two regions. And this is important because, frankly, this is really hard. Being able to restrict the movement physically of data, especially in this very dynamic world, is very difficult. And so mount filters, which is a Vault Enterprise feature, allows you to, during replication, and again, replication within Vault is a Vault Enterprise feature that focuses on being able to spin up and spin down different clusters of Vault that can then share data in either one of two ways. So being able to share data for the purpose of disaster recovery. So in the event that an entire availability zone or region goes down, that another region or data center or just something that's outside of sort of the risk of that original cluster can spin up and resume operations in a non-disruptive way. That's what we call DR or disaster recovery replication. The other one is performance replication, which is about how do I make sure that I can have localized access to data so to minimize round trip delay, while at the same time being able to stage writes and thread them so that as I scale an organization, as I scale sort of access to Vault, and I'm also scaling the writes linearly. That's really important and is actually the first version of replication that we developed here at HashiCorp Vault 0.7, because it allows you to grow your organization globally, which is something that is a critical requirement for many of our Vault Enterprise customers. So Mount Filters plays into this by allowing you to have a performance replication secondary cluster, so a follower cluster, have restricted access to certain types of secret mounts. And as well, we're about to see in this demo, what this will allow you to do is it will allow you to comply with the sort of the provisions behind Article 35 around how do I make sure that the data doesn't go to a locale that it shouldn't go to, while at the same time centralizing management for that data and centralizing management for the secrets, auth, and identity infrastructure around Vault as a whole. All right, so with that, let's go show you guys Mount Filters. So jump back in and all right. So from here, we're going to have two Vault clusters. So this tab over here is going to be the centralized management. Actually, let's go step back and kind of role play for a little bit about what the situation is. Let's say that I'm an EU organization that has a Vault infrastructure within France and then within the East Coast of the United States. So that implies two clusters. I have a cluster that's located within France and has HA nodes spread across France and centralized management in, say, Paris. And then I have a cluster that is for US East, roughly. That is basically on the eastern seaboard of the United States, centralized management somewhere like New York or Boston, and then HA nodes spread across that region accordingly so that in the event that the process dies there, that it can be resumed. The idea here is I would like to centralize management of my infrastructure as that EU organization, but provide localized access for the purposes of managing round trip delay, for scaling writes linearly, and then ultimately providing a basis for how do I spread globally. So not just to the United States, but to other locales. So Japan, Southeast Asia, etc. So I'm going to log in here. Ooh. Let's see. Always fun times with demos. Actually, one moment. I think we're having a little bit of a technical difficulty associated with this. So this should be a token as opposed to a key. While I make sure that this is actually properly being set up, Amanda, do we have any questions that we can answer really quickly?
We do. Andy, one of the first questions was asking if GDPR is an evolution of Safe Harbor.
Ooh, that's a great question. So sort of. The answer GDPR is really an evolution of a lot of different things. So GDPR is really focused heavily on the concept of it's an evolution of data security and privacy overall. So Safe Harbor certainly kind of like was one of the first, if not I believe the first kind of exhaustive data privacy GRCs that focused on sort of digital access to data in RBAC. So GDPR certainly learns lessons from Safe Harbor, but it is an independent EU-specific regulation. So there are sorts of, when we talk about why certain things are what they are within the GDPR, they're really a function of the legal environment as well as the regulatory environment within the European Union. Okay, well, things are back up. So let's log in to the cluster. So this is again the EU cluster, and then this is the US cluster. So US cluster they look pretty similar right now, and that's not that's because I've set them up to look pretty similar. But let's say that I have data within the EU that is ultimately, let's say that I have kind of two stripes of data, which is going to be pretty common. The first is I have a database here that is EU GDPR data. This is the database secrets engine within Vault. So this would be for credentials that give me access to databases that contain GDPR data. So this is a great feature within Vault because it allows me to centralize how I distribute sorts of access to various different types of databases and ultimately rotate credentials for those databases in the next version of Vault. By the way, fun fact, that's a really cool feature that's coming, etc. So I can set a number of options here, but let's just say that this exists and I populate it. Okay, let's also say that I have another set of database credentials that are for specifically US non-GDPR specific data. So I've got data here that's really critical for US-based applications, and I'd like to have that as part of the US cluster. I want to be able to populate that database backend with credentials associated with that, so I can broker access for applications accessing those databases. And this is, again, we're talking about databases here, but there are a variety of different types of secret engines within Vault that govern access to data, as well as storing it, key value, et cetera. We're iterating on those in exciting different ways in the next version of Vault, specifically within key value. So stay tuned on that. But basically, there's a lot of different pieces around how I manage the secrets infrastructure associated with this. But it's important that I'm going to be, and so the good side of that is that Vault allows you to centralize management of that infrastructure. The challenging part of that can be in the face of things like GDPR. How do I share some of the data, but also make sure that I centralize management of identity and everything else? So how to kind of carve out which data goes where. All right, so let's go set up a replication relationship here. So here I'm going to set up a performance replication relationship. So this is the EU cluster, and the EU cluster is going to be the primary, so it's going to be the leader of this, and I'm going to enable it. And then now what I'm going to do from the EU cluster is, again, I'm going to go set up a secondary cluster that shares the identity information, so it's the policy information, so role-based access control, et cetera, with that cluster in the United States. But I'm going to filter out what is the physical secret data that is actually being moved to the United States. So when I do that, I'm going to create a secondary, but I'm going to configure mount filtering. And the secondary ID is going to be US East 1. And configure the time to live for the token, and then after that, you have to refresh access to the cluster. So with mount filtering, there are two different ways to do this. I can either do it in whitelist, so basically only the selected mounts will be replicated, or I can do it in blacklist mode. For the purposes of simplicity, I'm just going to do blacklist right now. I'm going to say that all of the GDPR data going into the US cannot go there. So I'm going to blacklist this token, or this mount, this secret mount. So we've created the token, so I'm now going to go into the cluster in the United States. I'm going to set it up as a performance secondary to share information from the primary in the EU. And again, when we're setting up replication, regardless of whatever mode we're setting it up in, it's really important that you note that when the secondary is being spawned, it's going to clear all the data on the cluster. So I'm going to start mirroring effectively the infrastructure of whatever the primary is. So I've set up a secondary activation token. There's a variety of different kind of things I can configure with this, but this is going to be a pretty simple situation. So I set it up. It is now refreshing all the data and sort of starting to copy the data from the European Union cluster. Now when I go back and I take a look at the secrets infrastructure, ta-da, all the non-GDPR data is here and the GDPR data is gone. Well, that's great, but we don't live in a static world where things don't change on the EU side. So if we want to focus on a world where centralization management happens, while the GDPR data, the secrets engine data may change, what will also change is going to be the policy information associated with what is the RBAC around those secrets. So let's go to one of those policies, and let's say that we have another policy here, like the default policy, where I want to change something. So let's say that I want to change. This could really be any policy there. If I wanted to add a policy, for example, I could add a new one. But let's just say that I want to change this to read. It's important to centralize the management of all of your identity data, all of your policy data, et cetera. And once I've changed this within the EU cluster, what I want you to focus on is the fact that it changes in the West Coast cluster as well. So what does get replicated in this infrastructure is even the data for the GDPR data doesn't get replicated, so it stays in the EU. What does move around is the authentication data. So the policy data associated with RBAC to secrets, the identity data associated with unified identity. If I have control groups set up, which would be a function of policies, those would be replicated. And not just ACL policies, we've released as part of at HashiCorp last year, something called Sentinel. So Sentinel policies would be replicated. Basically, how I prescriptively give access to data and how I recognize who users are, as well as the secret mounts that I have not specifically selected as part of mount filtering. And that's mount filters. So with that, I think we're ready to start taking a lot of questions.
Okay, Andy. The next question was someone that read that the rights to erasure also includes logs that contained non-anonymized data. Could be an index log that contains the user's IP. Is that true?
Oh, these are good questions. Consult your lawyer or auditor for the answer to that question, because again, the GDPR gets a little bit infuriatingly non-prescriptive in certain areas, and this is unfortunately one of them. Let me show you another example of where that comes up. The GDPR says that you should employ encryption. The GDPR doesn't tell you what that encryption is. It's not like in the US where with something like common criteria, where I say, hey, you need to use a FIPS 140-2 certified algorithm. It says that you just need to have best effort around encryption. So it's really critical that you talk to your auditors and you talk to whoever's your lawyer, specifically your lawyer with access and experience working with the supervisory authority within your locale to answer that question.
Cool. Okay. The next question is only new data generated after the GDPR start date applicable?
No, and that's the problem. The GDPR focuses on, there might be aspects of GDPR that can be grandfathered, but in general, this is about data subjects' access and rights associated and security associated with their data.
Okay. And then the next question is, which version of Vault are the mount filters available on?
The mount filters have been available since, I believe, Vault 0.9. So they are in Vault as of today, and they're within Vault Enterprise Premium specifically.
Okay, and then another question is, do we have plans to include the web UI into the community OSS version?
Yes. Yes. So stepping back for a moment, the philosophy on Vault is really how we decide what features should go where. Is if the feature focuses on scaling and really making it easier to provide access for larger teams, the feature starts to kind of move into the Vault Enterprise area. If it's a security-based feature, if it's about like the core functionality of Vault, that's when it really is something that we focus on as part of Vault, what we call Vault open source, the community version of Vault as a whole. The UI has kind of always been in this weird situation because it straddles the worlds of enterprise and open source. But as you might have seen with HashiCorp, we're really an open source focused friendly company. So what we've been working on over the past year is trying to figure out how we can actually make the UI work within the community version, and then really how we want to open source the UI so that you can ultimately build your own modules into the UI. This is a need that we've been aware of as evidenced by the fact there are open source versions of the UI. There is, for example, I believe Goldfish, which is an open source UI that was written by a member of the Vault community. So we've been really keen on trying to figure out how we can properly open source the UI for a while. It is coming. It will be coming very soon, and unfortunately, I can't give you much more information than that. But it is coming very soon. Stay tuned.
Okay, and then one more question that we got is disaster replication versus perf replication, are they mutually performance replication? Are they mutually exclusive?
Ooh, good question. So right now they are, and they're mutually exclusive because the replication relationship itself is very different. DR clusters effectively they're sort of sealed. Effectively, you can't read or write to them. They exist in this kind of protected state where they're waiting to basically be elected to be the new primary. We are looking at in the future allowing you to read and write from them, but it's not going to be the same kind of situation with performance clusters. I mean, at best, they're going to be a read replica. Scaling writes linearly is something that's really a focus of perf replication. And so as a consequence, they are mutually exclusive in that regard. Will we provide the ability to have a DR cluster be a read replica? Possibly. It is something that we're considering on our long-term roadmap. We need to do a lot more research on it around the technical implications of it. Suffice to say, replication is something that is a very complex but very serious topic within the Vault team. So any kind of changes that are made to your application need to be done so in a very prescriptive way as not to break everything.
Cool. Okay, I think we've got one more, it looks like, unless other people want to quick submit some more questions. Andy, someone's asking if they centralize use of HSM while supporting many different replication regions, or can they? Or do they have to have HSM per cluster?
Ooh, also a good question. So HSMs are kind of another topic when we talk about Vault as a whole. And so let me briefly kind of cover where HSMs come into play within Vault. They come into play within the auto unseal process. So when I'm trying to unseal a cluster that's been sealed because you detected a data breach and you've kind of broken glass and slammed the brakes effectively into sealing the cluster. They also come into play as of Vault 0.9 in something called seal wrap. And seal wrap is a set of functionality that allows you to layer the cryptographic primitives within Vault with another enveloping layer of HSM or whatever is your unseal interface, AWS KMS, GCP KMS, etc., derived cryptography. That's important from an entry perspective. That's important from a secrets perspective, etc. So it's a really critical component there, and that means that the HSM becomes a very critical component within your within how I think about Vault as a whole. Now, switching gears from into replication, you do not need to have a one-to-one relationship between HSMs and clusters, but what you do need to be mindful of is the fact that if you want to use seal wrap, that HSM is going to ultimately be unwrapping the cryptographic primitives of all of your different clusters for Vault. So you need to be mindful of sort of like the location of your HSMs, the consequence of that, and then ultimately sorts of like HA with your HSMs. So Vault doesn't support a specific HSM. Vault supports the PKCS11 protocol. Beyond that, Vault has no visibility in sort of the infrastructure behind your HSM, and different HSMs, whether you're talking about SafeNet Lunas or Talus N-Shields or whatever, they all support different ways of handling HA. So it's really critical that you consult your HSM documentation as well as your HSM provider to figure out sort of how do I want to think about that kind of performance workload as well as that kind of HA workload. Because if I enable seal wrap, my HSM really becomes critical infrastructure. It was always critical infrastructure before, but it was only critical infrastructure for like a ceremony within Vault. Now it is infrastructure for everything related to Vault around like storing secrets and retrieving secrets.
Cool. Okay, Andy, and then I think we're going to take one last question that I think is more something you touched on in the beginning that we should just reiterate. Someone's asking how they know if they're GDPR compliant when they're using Vault. And you kind of talked in the beginning regarding lawyers.
The answer to that is, yeah, talk to your lawyer. talk to people that are, again, GDPR is a framework. It's a framework of regulatory compliance regulations that are ultimately focused on allowing EU data to be and privacy data to be as sensitive and protected as possible. What it implies doesn't imply, what it requires doesn't require. Ultimately, how each one of the articles of the GDPR are enforced, it's going to depend upon the interpretation of GDPR from your supervisory authority, because the supervisory authority is going to be the one that levies fines for you, as well as, says you are, if you've even defined, are you in the negligence tier or the non-negligence tier? So there isn't, it's going to be kind of a complex interweave of sort of what your supervisory authority thinks for the data, as well as what your auditor thinks for the data. So it's really critical that you work with your legal counsel as well as with your auditors to determine, how does Vault enable my GDPR compliance? Now, these are features that will enable sorts of what the articles are either explicitly saying or sort of the spirit behind the articles. But at the end of the day, you're going to have to talk to your legal infrastructure as well as your auditors to make sure that Vault, as well as every other security tool within your infrastructure, is helping you to achieve compliance per the supervisory authority that you are beholden to.
Awesome. Okay, thanks for the clarification, Andy. So with that, I think we will end Q&A. Thank you, Andy, and thank you to the audience. Those were some great questions today. I hope everyone enjoyed today's webinar and feels more prepared for GDPR compliance using Vault. Thank you for joining, and a big thank you to Andy for his time today. I also want to mention that HashiCorp is hiring, so if you liked what you heard today, please take a look at our jobs page at hashicorp.com/jobs and see if there might be a fit for you. And finally, as I mentioned at the beginning, this webinar was recorded and we'll make the recording available on our website after processing. I will also send an email to everyone who registered with the recording link. You can also keep your eyes out on Twitter. I'll post it there usually later today. Have a great day. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.